Hello, everybody. Very good morning in Latin America and very good afternoon in Europe to all of you who are following us via YouTube and Facebook. My name is Gianluca Gardini. I am Professor of International Relations and Latin American Politics and Chairholder for International Business at Friedrich Alexander University at Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to this event entitled COVID-19 and the Changing International Scenario in the framework of the Jean Monnet project Relations between the European Union and Latin America, Future Scenario in a Changing World. So today I have the pleasure to welcome four very established and internationally renowned colleagues to share with you some ideas about the developments of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 situation 1.5 years into the pandemic. So it is, first of all, my pleasure to welcome Catia Miriam Costa. Welcome, Miriam. Miriam is a researcher and an invited professor at the Center for International Study of Isqueté, the University Institute of Lisbon. Miriam specializes in China's foreign policy and international discourse, and she's also the director of the chair of Global Ibero-America at the European Institute of International Studies in Stockholm and Salamanca. With us, we also have Diego Bernardini. Diego, you're the most welcome. Diego is professor of medicine at Mar del Plata National University in Argentina, and he's also a full professor of postgraduate studies at the Barceló Foundation in Buenos Aires. He's also a consultant in health and well-being, and he has acquired professional experience at the World Health Organization. Welcome also to Professor Beatriz Larrain Martinez. Welcome, Beatriz, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law and Social Sciences of the University of Concepcion in Chile, and she holds a PhD in Law, Politics, and Society from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and her area of interest and research is especially the judicialization of politics. It is also my pleasure to welcome Professor Andreas Falke. Welcome, Andreas. Andreas is Professor Emeritus of International Studies here at Friedrich Alexander University in Germany. He specializes in the politics of trade policy, transatlantic economic relations, and the role of the United States and the European Union in the world trading system.
I'm afraid it's not working.
So today we have this event in a round table format. That is, our guest will kick off with a short intervention between 5 to 7 minutes to introduce their topic, and then I will ask them some questions before we open the floor to the public to receive your comments, your questions, and all your ideas. You are the most welcome to interact with us via the chat function that you can find in Facebook and in YouTube. So before we kick off, as usual, some thanking and some acknowledgement are due, as usual, and in particular, I would like to thank the European Union for its support. This event is only possible thanks to the support of the Erasmus Plus of the European Commission. Thank you also to the organizer and coordinator of this program, Paulina Astorza Suarez, who is professor at the University of Concepcion in Chile. So we're now ready to kick off. Please use again the chat function on YouTube and Facebook to interact with us. We will open the floor to questions from the public after the first few rounds of questions. So we can start with Miriam Costa, who will give us an introduction and an update on the role of China in a COVID-19 international scenario. Miriam, you're the most welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gianluca. I would like to thank Gianluca and Paulina for organizing this event and for inviting me. My topic is really interesting because I think we had this post-COVID era simultaneously with the rethinking of the role of China in the world. So I will start by the impacts of COVID-19 in domestic policy and in the Chinese society. Then we will move to foreign policy consequences of the COVID-19 in the Chinese external policy. At the end, we will talk a little bit about international politics and this international changing scenario, as the title expresses very well what is happening in this moment. COVID-19 had several consequences inside Chinese society and direct impact in domestic policy. So one of the most discussed topics in the Chinese communities was the fact the government was not being so transparent. So when we in the Western countries, usually we have this idea of no discussion within the Chinese society. And although the exchange of discourses is somehow controlled, the truth is that this lack of transparency was one of the items people were debating and was present, for instance, in social media. And this lack of transparency had to do not only with the period in between the identification and the action against the virus in Wuhan, but also all the debate about the origins and the way the debate was being dealt with. Another important aspect that brought up some tension inside Chinese society and is still on is the fact of the lack of mobility. People are being, they cannot move even inside China, and that's been a very hard problem because people are thinking and are demanding for more vaccination. And as you know, and this connects directly with the Chinese foreign policy, as part of these vaccines are being exported, and the number of the people not vaccinating in China is still very relevant. It's a relevant number. It is a high percentage of the population. There is still this problem about mobility and seen as an obstacle to not only to citizenship, but also for to have more freedom for economy. Because as you know, Chinese are very centered and economy, even Chinese individuals. So this is a problem for them. And another thing is that there was this raising of distrust in the governmental institutions, and at the same time a demand for dialogue with the citizen. So these are new challenges for power that is trying to concentrate and being more personalized. And it's a phenomenon that you should see as almost an exception since the Mao's presidency. So President Xi Jinping has a concentration of power that was not seen since President Mao. So at the domestic level, we have this increasing distrust in the government and some demand for more transparency, more mobility, and more dialogue with the citizens. In the foreign policy aspect, we have we have this vaccine diplomacy or masks diplomacy that we all heard about. So this was a way of China showing to the world she was had solidarity, she could help. But it has another point, a very interesting point that China did not count on it. It was that some countries identified some dependence on China because they could not have the medical devices, the vaccines, or even the masks to have for their internal market or to help other countries. And part of our project in Europe about industrialization or even this application of the plans of resilience have to do with this being this awareness of being dependent by globalization or through globalization to become dependent of Chinese markets. So one thing that seemed at the beginning that could give advantage to China really puts the space of China and the diplomatic action of China in question. Another interesting thing is that although in the discourse we are always hearing about multilateralism, and China is always defending multilateral institutions to solve international problems, the truth is that China, during this COVID crisis, reinforced her bilateral diplomacy by direct relations with countries, whether it through vaccine or medical devices diplomacy, so health diplomacy, or for other means. So this means that something that would be very positive or could be seen in the very positive way brought up some paradoxes, not only of globalization, but also of this dependence on China. And then this, at the same time, simultaneously, we have from the international politics side something very interesting, which is this technological competence between China and the United States that went through, that we are always talking about the 5G, but we know we have a commercial competition, commercial and technological competition that has this coincidence of being during and after after the COVID-19 crisis. So it's not a coincidence. It's the commercial confrontation was on, but the thing was that through this sanitary crisis, we were aware of what we were facing. We were facing a country that could sometimes challenges the established powers or this international order based on a traditional Western view. But something, and I end with it because I'm afraid I take too much time. One interesting thing we should be aware is that China was one of the winners of the Second World War. So if we look back, we are not still changing the paradigm of the winners of the Second World War, because China is in the Security Council. So what we are not shifting all the paradigm. We are shifting from one part of the winners to another geographical part of the winners. This shift can happen or not, but the truth is that China is becoming more challenging. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. We already have a lot of food for thought. And now I would like to give the floor to Diego Bernardini for an overview on global health governance and the role of the World Health Organization 1.5 years into the crisis. Diego, welcome to the show. The floor is yours. Microphone.
Okay, right now it's fine. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to share this short space with you, with your colleagues, and thank you very much to Paulina Stroza for your kind support. I would like to start with, as you know, the crisis of coronavirus has a typical pace of global phenomena, was and is it really fast and widespread. COVID-19 has confronted the world with a situation that begin, as you know, as a health crisis and then become a social one, including aspects really close related with health, but with other kind of dimensions like global health diplomacy, security, and now the new, as you surely read it, new vaccine diplomacy. The situation brought under public scrutiny the value of leadership in the political sphere, especially with the World Health Organization for obvious reasons. It is nothing new that WHO, that is the specialized agency of the United Nations in health, is under scrutiny due to both lack of vision and increasing loss of prestige. This is a dramatic issue in terms of the situation that we are living since a year, on almost in a year and a half ago. Both are due, at least in part, of a conflict of interest that not only perceived but also are real. If you remember, when the former president Trump decided to cut U.S. payments and contributions to the agency, has reinforced, unfortunately, the presence of WHO under the spots. In those days, almost a year and a half ago, my paper, The Need for a New Governance in Health, the Role of WHO, has tried to clarify some understanding about the global health governance and the role of WHO at the global arena. I think in today's international arena, many actors are active in the field of health. There are national institutions, such as the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, of the Chinese Center of Disease Control and Prevention too. There are specialized public agencies, such as the Global Fund to Fight Tuberculosis, Malaria, and AIDS of the UN, of course, or also the Public-Private Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. There are other privately funded agencies, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, other sub-regional governmental mechanisms or institutions, such as the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPHA, or the traditional regional and multilateral organizations, such as the Andean Global Bank or the World Bank. All of them have their own health specialists. Most of them have faster administrative procedures and decision-making timeframes, and most importantly, almost all of them have better financing than the WHO. I think to understand a great part of the weaknesses of WHO is needed to know some basic aspects of the WHO financing mechanism. In a simple way, we have that each of the 194 member states pays an agreed annual contribution. But on the other hand, the rest of the budget comes from so-called voluntary contributions, most of them with conditioned rules. The problem is that the balance of this type of different funding has been increasing since 1988 in relation to country quotes. For example, during the period 2017-2018, it was 80% of WHO total budget, which in that year was 2.2 billion American dollars. This budget, for example, is equivalent to 30% of the annual budget of the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, based in Atlanta. Or, for example, 4% of the annual profit for a pharmaceutical company like Pfizer. Or, for example, 10% of what the pharmaceutical industry spends on advertising. The imbalance in how WHO is funded is so significant that the Gates Foundation, for example, contribute about with other 10% of its budget, and the United States with 15% of the total budget of WHO. Contrary to what one might think, curiously, WHO received more money from the former Trump administration than from the President Obama, according to Forbes. I think I would like to put on the table another relevant aspect, and is the limited technical capacity of WHO. Firstly, because it cannot afford to pay the best technical staff who find better horizons at higher salaries in other agencies, bodies, or also at the private sector. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it is because the already limited operational capacity must be harmonized with the political mandate given by its member state, where global health diplomacy takes away from the weight and decision-making of more instrumental activities. These reasons have undoubtedly contributed to undermine WHO reputation. This is real, and you can find this everywhere. But some mistakes depended on the organization leadership, unfortunately, and its choices were perhaps more decisive in reaching the current situation. In this point, I would like to remark one aspect: intelligence. Intelligence is a property that not only concerns people, it is also, or should be, an attribute of institutions, especially those of global relevance. Institutional intelligence allows, among other things, to anticipate scenarios. This basic principle, but not for that reason universal, should be reason for reflection on the WHO. In public health, for many people, these are disconcerting times, particularly because a large part of public health that does not precisely go through the health field. The weight is falling more and more on global health diplomacy, which conditions the design and implementation of multilateral and national health programs worldwide. At this point, more than a year in pandemic, with many different measures of national policies, I mean quarantine, confinements, is mandatory to rethink in a new WHO. The first thing that needs to be rethought in that since the COVID-19 pandemic, there is not a longer clear difference between animal health and human health. There is only one health, there is one global health. Health is only in a view of the facts. It becomes necessary that the world ask itself what kind of WHO it wants for the future. Not only a reformulation of its objective, its goals and mandates, everything is mandatory, but also a reconceptualization of its financial mechanism, its transparency, and also the accountability, and of course, its operational work. To these ends, it is essential to optimize and raise the level of cooperation and information exchange among the public, private, and civil actors that make up the architecture of global health. Today, the value added to all global efforts in health, but not only in health, is cooperation. This is something that the coronavirus has unfortunately reminded us of in a dramatic way. We are in a time of crisis, but this can also be seen as an opportunity to improve and reestablish the WHO as a value instrument. Thank you very much, Gianluca. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diego. A really provocative and thought-provoking intervention that probably will push us all to rethink about the World Health Organization and the way in which we understand health and global health governance. And talking about global health governance and possible further development, we should not forget that COVID-19 is very likely to give rise to more judicial cases. And we have an expert, Beatriz Larrain, with us to tell us something more about the likely judicialization of the COVID-19 issue. Beatriz, welcome to the show. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gianluca. Good morning to everybody in Chile. Good afternoon to everybody in Europe. Like Gianluca said, I teach and I study judicialization, which means the way in which judges are today being asked by citizens on a global scale to solve all kinds of issues of human social life and all kinds of value-laden aspects. And now with COVID, even issues that are not necessarily within their realm of technical knowledge. Judges are not doctors. They're not specialists in pandemics or vaccines, but they're being asked anyways by citizenry to limit governments, to declare whether quarantines, for example, are legal or not, what's going on with vaccines, for example. So the problems or the issues that we had currently judicialized as society, from abortion, for example, to euthanasia, or even aspects of economic life, are now turned, right? The focus is now turned to the pandemic and COVID-19. The current levels of judicialization regarding the pandemic are really astonishing, as practically every aspect of the pandemic has been brought at one time or another before a court of law. And this is something that has occurred on a worldwide scale. It's not something that's happening in Europe or in America or in Latin America or in the Middle East. It's happening everywhere. In France, for example, the citizens have taken the government to court, challenging the restrictions to protests and marches. For example, the government prohibited a protest of more than 10 people, whereas malls, shopping malls, and schools remained open, where obviously more than 10 people were present. We know that the French streets have been the stage of multiple protests over the last decades, and therefore there was an issue of whether the government was really using the restrictions to avoid COVID or to avoid protests. In Germany, for example, in Berlin, courts have laid aside government efforts to stop public protests, again, against COVID restrictions, which is all against the restrictions, right, and quarantines that governments had ordered. In Spain, in France, in Germany, restaurant owners, pub owners have required judges to stop government restrictions because they have been affected in their sales. In Austria, for example, one of the first big-scale lawsuits, a very exclusive and elegant ski resort was sued by many of the people who got sick because they said that the management of the ski resort knew beforehand of COVID-19 and that there was an outbreak at the restaurant, but they didn't close the ski resort because they didn't want to affect business. In Spain, for example, thousands of legal actions against the government have been presented. In April of last year, a group brought before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, a lawsuit against Pedro Sanchez, head of the government, for the genocide of 50,000 people. This is a head of state being accused of genocide, which is a very grave crime, because they did not handle the pandemic in a way as to avoid the death of so many people. Similar things happened in Italy. In Bergamo, for example, public prosecutors are prosecuting some mayors and some local government officials because of the way they handled the pandemic. They've been accused of knowing ahead of time what was going to happen and not reacting in the way that they should have. And similar issues worldwide. In the United States, for example, the focus has been a little different, whereas the focus last year of judicialization was the measures that the different states took to ease voting so that people could vote in more in easier ways and without a risk of getting the virus. And there were challenges in different states, for example, for mail-in votes for senior citizens, or there was in one state they had a kind of a drive-through voting where you could, you know, go in your car, vote, and then leave your vote. And all of that was submitted to judges because at one point or another, people believed that this was illegal or it was unfair, or somehow the government was restricting or creating measures that were harming human rights. The Council of Europe, for example, last year had on its webpage an announcement saying that anybody who knew of illegal restrictions or public or private places that were not taking care of citizens, making sure that they were not harmed by COVID, were encouraged to denounce these malpractices before the Council of Europe. And of course, the judicial arm of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights. These transnational courts like the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice are very powerful entities, so powerful that, for example, Brexit, one of the slogans of the campaign, "Let's take our power back," was announced as taking power back from the European Court of Justice. This is something new in a worldwide scenario where this freedom campaign, we're free from the European Union and we're free from a court of law. This is something pretty much unseen, you know, because judges are now powerful political actors in ways that they were not before. Judges now make public policy. And we've seen this, not even vaccine diplomacy. It's not even diplomacy, right? It's just vaccine judicialization with this lawsuit against AstraZeneca for not complying with the amount of doses that it promised the European Union that it would give. And AstraZeneca is accused of giving, you know, outside of this contract with the European Union, of giving vaccines to other countries, specifically Britain, outside of the agreement that they had made with the European Union. And where is this all playing out? It's playing out in a scenario which is fairly recent, which is a judicial arena. Whereas before we had other scenarios where political forces clashed, now the scenarios are courts of law. And as the title of this talk was Future Scenarios in a Changing World, what can we say about COVID-19, judges, and the future? I believe that we can only hope for more judicialization. And whether this is good or bad is something that we can talk about and discuss a little bit later. But definitely judges, despite the fact, like I said earlier, that they are not doctors, they're not experts in vaccines, are having a very strong say in what is right and what can governments do and not do regarding COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz. A very fascinating topic, and I already look forward to probe you a little more to understand really where this could take us. Apologies to all the people in the public for, first of all, for the delay with which we started. But as you can perhaps already appreciate, that was due to technical problems with the connection of Professor Falke. We have been trying to re-establish connection with him. I asked our director of program if there is any chance to have Professor Falke with us, or maybe not. Nope. Okay, so maybe we go on with our discussion, and then if technology allows and Professor Falke can reconnect with us, we will have his intervention. So my proposal is that now we follow the same order, and I would like to probe you a little bit more on your first intervention. I mean, I would start with Miriam. Miriam, you suggested and discussed the strong activism of China with vaccine diplomacy, with mass diplomacy. But is there a possibility that we can face and see more isolation of China internationally as a result of the, I don't know, the initial mismanagement or lack of information from the Chinese government, or as a result of further development, in your views? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Gianluca. I believe that it's interesting because this isolation provoked by the virus, and it was an auto-isolation, at the end resulted in an international isolation of the country of China. So I think more than the domestic constraints, the issue was about the way China was promoting her diplomacy, and simultaneously also the impact it had on the third countries, meaning that this knowledge of being more dependent on China for the healthcare system, for medical devices, masks, or even to have a consortium for vaccines, somehow threatened the countries, the other countries, so Western countries, felt this like a threat, like a menace, no? So they were being challenged by this new power. So the beginning of the thing was that China auto-isolated herself, but then the other countries associated for challenging the way China was leading, seemed to be leading this process. I see we have our colleague now of the panel, so maybe I will give the floor because we are having so many technical problems, and we can go through afterwards.
Thank you, Miriam. That's very kind of you. So we are delighted to see Professor Andreas Falke on the screen. We have heard a lot about China. Andreas, we would love to hear from you a first intervention about the impact of COVID-19 and the United States. The floor is yours, and you're finally very welcome to the program.
Thank you, Gianluca, and all the others. I hope you can hear me well. Starting off and kind of connecting to the original paper, I think Corona was the major reason for Trump to be defeated. That is, the American people basically punished his mishandling of the Corona crisis and his leadership failures. And that, of course, with some obstacles, brought Mr. Biden into the presidency. And with Biden, I think on the surface, we have a traditional multilateralist and a believer in cooperation and traditional diplomacy. But I think we should add a note of caution that the 4 years of Trump have left a deep trace in the American polity. And I think Biden will not be fully able to erase them. Some of the problems that Trump had was that he simply disregarded scientific evidence, that he went for an America alone, not just America first, but America alone strategy. And Biden, of course, is slowly trying to reverse it. But it's a very slow reversal. And you may have seen this, particularly in the calls from Europe, from the European Union, that the US should share vaccines. And it wasn't actually until about last week that Biden has agreed to ship about 500 million doses of vaccines mostly to developing countries. But in the end, this was also a reaction to China's activities and China's engagement, because I think China has so far made available, I think, about almost a trillion vaccines. Although we should note, of course, that Chinese generosity doesn't come for free. I think you had some cases where, particularly in Latin America, the Chinese would pressure governments there, to accept Chinese technology in the 5G sector. So it's nothing is unproblematic on this. The Biden administration also made a point of waiving intellectual property rights for the vaccine production. I think it's a very, very generous gesture, except the Europeans have stopped it so far. So they can make that concession, but so far it doesn't really mean anything. What the Biden administration its mantra is the return to a rules-based international order. Question is, which rules are meant? Who's defining those rules? It's not clearly international law. It's something a bit more diffuse as we see it. But by and large, I think the Biden administration has made a good faith effort to be much more cooperative on the crisis. We should also say, if we look at the domestic aspects, the Biden administration has been fairly successful in vaccinating the population. However, it does have problems in certain states, particularly those being governed by Republicans in the South. So it still has problems there. So it isn't really the example. But make it short. I mean, it's clearly an improvement, and we have to see whether this cooperative strand will get stronger, or whether it gets caught in domestic squabbles. So I would say yes, there is much more of a return to multilateralism, cooperation, diplomacy. We could see this in the various summits last week, but I don't think we are totally over the Trump years yet. They simply throw their shadow on the United States and United States relations with other countries. Now I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So I propose that we restore the initial order, and I would take advantage of that to ask Andreas if you could expand a little bit on this difference between the Trump and the Biden administration approach. I mean, has the Biden administration taken an approach that is clearly different from the Trump administration in terms of combating against COVID-19? Can you please expand and give us a few examples?
The Biden administration. Can you hear me, Gianluca? Because my mic was muted. Okay, I think one clear difference is that the Biden administration never denied the seriousness of the crisis. The Trump administration said, "Oh, the virus is going to go away. We're in charge of it." I mean, the Trump administration, from during the election campaign and when it got into office, basically said this is the major thing that we have to deal with. You can actually see it in the what's called the American Recovery Plan, massive subsidies for local and state governments to get vaccination started. Also, campaigns to address minority concerns, African Americans and Latinos. So it took. I mean, we have to be honest. Also, the Biden administration had this thing: let's vaccinate Americans first. I think that's. But I think any other thing, kind of in the sequencing, would have been deadly for the Biden. So they they would first have to take care in a way of their own population, and now we'll get into a new phase. I think the real yardstick would be if the Biden administration can really help to get global vaccine production started on a global scale. I don't think that's going to be so easy. It needs certain resources. It needs support. One interesting thing, though, is that recently came to light. It's true the Chinese have made a lot of, a large amount of vaccine available. There is now some evidence that actually the Chinese vaccines aren't as effective. So, in the end, if they all play it right, the U.S. actually may come out of this in a much better light. But we have to see how this is going to develop. One thing, COVAX, this international initiative, how much are they going to put into it? So I think the outlook is much better. Also much better than, let's say, in spring of 2021. But we are really not there. We are not really close to a global solution of this crisis. But the standing of the United States, I think, has clearly improved as compared to the period under the Trump administration.
Very good, thank you. I ought to return the floor to Miriam. Miriam, is there anything that you wanted to add on this tension between international activism and international isolation of China as a result of the pandemic?
No, only this interesting thing of having this coincidence about having this dispute on commercial and technological issues, and simultaneously having the COVID-19, which really affected not in the causes or even in the tension, but in the timing of growing tension, meaning that it made more, it was more clear to the United States the role China was playing in the world, and simultaneously it was more clear for other Western countries the dependence they had on China. So I think we are all rethinking our roles in international setting, and we are reframing our foreign policies. And this is making of China a more isolated country from these Western countries, and not so much from other countries. Although I have something to add to this, is that curiously, I think it was last week, it was published a survey about the Southeastern countries, South Asian countries. And it was very interesting because they said when they were asked if they preferred the presence of the United States or of China in a political perspective, they would say that they would prefer the United States because they are distant, so they are. You prefer to have a distant political influence, than your frontier neighbors. So it's interesting that in some countries you see that really things are reshaping, but in other continents like Latin America or even Africa, we don't know who is going to win. So this isolation is more from our perspective than it might be from what is really happening if we take in consideration the globality of the countries.
Thank you. And there is an unavoidable question for Diego. Diego, you discussed already the role of the WHO into the beginning of the pandemic, but now 1.5 years on, how do you see the role of the organization, and has anything changed in the role and standing of the World Health Organization?
Well, I think as Professor Falke mentioned, I think in those aspects with the change of the authorities in US, WHO received a reinforce in terms to return US to the arena, and also for the financial mechanisms and also for the technical assistance for WHO. But on the other hand, I think that we are uh, living in a very dynamic scenario when many different questions could be rise up in a future in a dramatic way. I think two aspects mentioned before for Beatriz was really interesting in terms of the judicialization against the pharma for the contract, and also the judicialization against authorities. For example, Brazil. Last week in Brazil, the number of deaths crossed the limit of 500,000 deaths. Brazil, for example, have history to imprison former presidents. So I think those aspects will be influenced quite probably in the future um, reconfiguration on the future role of WHO. I think nowadays the global establishment put in standby the the discussion, the the real role of WHO. We are assisting in a kind of standby moment, in a calm, probably before the storm. So we need to be really aware of the global scenario that will be for sure play a very important and relevant role in the future of WHO.
Thank you. Well, you've given a wonderful assistance to Beatriz, which I cannot absolutely ignore. But before I give the floor to Beatriz, I would like to remind to everybody who is following us, please don't be shy and send us your comments and questions via the chat function in YouTube and Facebook, and we will be delighted to interact with you directly in a few minutes. Beatriz, so Diego has given you this fantastic assistance. So what can we foresee for the future in this judicialization trend with regards to COVID then?
Well, with not only with regards to COVID, but in general, judicialization is a trend that's here to stay. Some have spoken of the government of judges. And the question is, do we want a government of judges? Do we want judges to have this kind of power? Because in traditional political or democratic theory, the citizens give up part of their power to be ruled by the state, right? To be ruled by the state, even by force if necessary. But what's the problem with judges is when we give up that power to state organizations, we do it to Congress or to the executives that we can somehow control. How? Through voting. We can control them when we vote. If we don't want somebody, if somebody hasn't met our expectations as a government authority, we vote them out of their office. But what's the problem with judges? Judges are not elected. Nobody elected judges, right? So how does the citizenry control what judges are doing in a democratic state? Judges, if we think about, I don't know, complex issues, not just vaccines or COVID, abortion rights, for example. The question is, do we want unelected officials that we cannot control to have a say in who has the right to have an abortion and who doesn't? Or do we prefer that legislatures make that choice for us? Because congressmen and women, we can control in a way when we vote. Judges, we can't. They can make their decisions in a sovereign way. So this is the against argument for judicialization. And the argument for judicialization, on the other hand, is in the judicial arena, we can play out, or judges can defend the interests of minorities, in general of minorities. Whereas in the legislative process, you have to, decisions are taken by majority vote, whereas judges don't need a majority vote. So judges in a way are better equipped to protect minorities. For example, if we think about a small country that the laboratory doesn't comply with the vaccine supply it promised, what can it do on a global scale? It can't do anything. It can't start a war, for example, over vaccines. Although, you know, wars have been started over soccer matches, so you never know. But what can they do, you know, now in a global scenario? Well, there's international courts that they can go to. They can sue the labs. They can sue other countries. Smaller countries have a power that they didn't have before in that sense. The citizenry, the polity, has a power, or is now aware of a power that it has, right, in judging and suing these even governments. The problem is, like I said at the beginning, is that what we want as a global community? Do we want these global problems to be solved by global courts? I don't know the answer, because it's something that we haven't dealt with before. Never in the history of civilized humanity, if you like, have we had this power of the state so strong and with so many different issues that they're being asked to answer. So in a way, we're facing a political scenario that we have not faced before, ever. So we'll see what comes of that, and whether the consequences are good, bad. Will we get to a point where we want to stop this power of judges, or is it something that will keep, you know, adding fuel to this flame? I don't know. We can only speculate for now.
Interesting times ahead. Thank you, Beatriz. I think we have time for one more round of questions, a quick one. And again, I start with Andreas. Andreas, but in the end, can we see any change or any improvement in actual cooperation between the United States and its international partners? Microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I think what we're seeing is that the Biden administration is starting to build bridges. Now the question is whether these bridges are strong enough to carry the cooperation. I think the strongest idea in coping with this crisis, if Europe, as the European Union and the US, would kind of cooperate in really increasing vaccine supply, because the major producers, evidently, of these vaccines are in the US and in Europe, respectively. If that happens, I think that depends also on a lot of variables that we may not control. Remember, there is a new variant, the Delta variant, which is more infectious and more lethal. If Europeans and Americans get together and cooperate, I think, and add a supply that will benefit those countries who are not quite as able, then I think that will be a very positive thing. Of course, another country may be India, that may be in there, but that has certain problems. We have to see. I think we'll see this in the fall, early fall, whether all these promises that Biden has made at the summits, the EU summit, in particular, NATO summit may not be quite as relevant here, whether we have a new basis that will really help to manage and overcome this crisis. So we may have a third session, let's say in September or October, to see to have an idea how far these things have moved. It may actually make sense.
Well, thank you for the suggestion. If the other colleagues agree, we can certainly meet up again later on this year or next year for another, hopefully, post Corona assessment of the situation. But for the time being, like it or not, we're still into this coronavirus context. And I would like to ask Miriam, do you think that we can consider somehow the corona pandemic a sort of interrupting factor for the over-two dynamics in China? And in this sense, can COVID-19 have compromised the Chinese approach or Chinese rapprochement to Western model of development and social relations?
Yes, I think there is a consequence of this, that as we are accelerating our competition in technical and commercial areas, which also affect the health sector, the one being in the sanitarian cooperation, I think maybe this is the result that while China was approaching and was becoming a huge, a prominent actor in multilateral level, and was trying to conquer a position in this multilateral fora. Maybe now the situation and this different competition we are having now will make China rethink the level of engagement in these international forums, which can really have as a result not the rapprochement of the Western models, but an increasing distance of these models. Because as China wanted to have her international confirmation as a full actor of the international scene, was trying to attract countries to her developed model. For instance, we have the Belt and Road Initiative as an example, and simultaneously was using other forums, international forums, to participate in what we call the Bretton Woods system, so the post-World War system. And now we have from one side and the other side, or meaning the Western side and China's side, a more confrontational framework in the international scene. So I think one of the consequences was this accelerating process of confrontation probably will take China for a more distant path from the Western countries. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And there is another probably unavoidable question for our medical expert and global health governance expert, Diego. The vaccine are the big thing at this stage of the pandemic. So how do you analyze the vaccine scenario, and in particular, the global distribution and the inequality between countries in this respect?
Well, this is a great question. I think that we are expecting what is going on with for example, the Delta variant and also the second generation vaccines. But I think most important than this is the double scenario that we are watching right now in terms of the vaccination speed and the vaccination plans accomplished for the different countries. I think the pandemic will increase the inequality and also inequity in terms of the both speed, both velocities in terms of hemispheres. No, I think it's a dramatic to watch what is going on with the COVAX mechanisms, and also what is going on with the donations and with some countries or regions that particularly they didn't receive vaccines or a small amount of this. Do not forget that we are living in a syndemic. The concept that was raised on the 90s and published in at the Lancet when the problem starts in a health crisis, but nowadays we are living how this situation is affecting the development in terms of the poverty, in terms of the debts, in terms of many, many variables that are around of the health. Nowadays, health is a development concept. We need help people to develop a country, but the country to turn in a developed country need help people. So it's impossible to separate these scenarios. And the pandemic showing nowadays that the scenario is in a separating way, wide and wide, with each dramatic situation that the COVID put on the table since a year and a half ago. So I am really concerned in terms of the future, and I am absolutely convinced that we have, we are in the middle, in the early moment of this pandemic.
Thank you. Unfortunately, not a very encouraging comment, but let's see if maybe Beatriz can give us some more optimistic prospects in this respect. So you told us about the mechanism of digitalization. You've told us about possible examples of what may happen, but there is perhaps a more important and broader question. Why, in the end, is the judicialization of the pandemic important?
Well, Gianluca, it's important in general. Judicialization is important, and specifically in the pandemic, because it shows that in some ways we're not trusting our governments. Because if we do not trust the executive powers, if we do not trust the legislatures, if we're not trusting technical officials of governments, health ministers, and we're suing them, we're accusing them of genocide, then it means we have a broader problem of government mistrust. Governments are not doing, at least in the opinion of the citizenry, are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not reacting fast enough. They're not doing things in a way that we would wish them to do. Whether this is real or not, whether they have the power to do humanly to do more, that's besides the point. The thing is that people perceive that governments are slow, that governments are corrupt, that governments are not technically equipped to deal with the issues of modern life. And now this has just blossomed with the pandemic in a way. And I think it shows that we need to rethink the way that governments present themselves before the polity, because it means that there is somehow a void of power. There is Congress isn't doing enough, technical bodies aren't doing enough, governments aren't doing enough. So what are we doing? We're going to this other power of the state, which is the third branch, the judicial branch, hoping in a way that they'll fill this power or they'll do something, you know, to make it better. And they're not equipped to make it better. So in a way, what judicialization can do in this scenario is just open up a whole new avenue for frustration, for people seeing that our governments are not equipped to do what they should do. And I think that's dangerous in terms of democracy. If we mistrust our governments, we open the door to populist governments, candidates, etc. So I think judicialization mirrors, in a way, this huge mistrust that we have of our traditional political powers. And I think that's something that we have to look at. on a global scale, because this isn't just the United States or Europe or Latin America or even Asia. Remember Korea before the pandemic. This is everywhere. Mistrust of the traditional branches of government, traditional political powers. And I think that's very dangerous for democracy.
Thank you, Beatriz. And this also goes well together with what Miriam said in her first intervention. It's not only mistrust in democratic government, but we have also learned that the Chinese society is not as monolithic as it may at first appear. So probably we will see some cracks also in the Chinese system. We will see. Definitely very interesting times ahead. Our perspective was not able to provide a positive appraisal. It looks like we still face immense challenges now and in the months and years ahead. We're coming to a closure of this program, and I would like to thank once again all our distinguished guests. Thank you, Professor Andreas Falke. Thank you, Professor Miriam Costa. Thank you, Professor Diego Bernardini. And thank you, Professor Beatriz Larrain. I also would like to thank all the participating institutions in this consortium, the University of Concepcion, University Diego Portales, Friedrich Alexander University, the University of Alicante, the University Carlos III de Madrid, the Andean University Simón Bolívar, and the Pontifical University of Salamanca. And thank you, of course, to our director of the program today, Pablo Navarro. Thank you for your technical assistance. And thank you to all of you who have been following us this morning or this afternoon, respectively, in Latin America and Europe. I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. And please keep following us and keep following the events of this program, following all the social media of the program of European Studies at the University of Concepcion. Thank you very much. Take care, stay healthy, and goodbye.